Cub Cadet Lt1050 will not crank. I have replaced the battery solenoid. While sitting in the seat with the brake engaged, PTO switch is off, there is no crank.
Let's start by checking to see if there's a blown fuse. They are generally located in front of the dash under the hood, but if you do not see it, here's a surefire way to locate it. It can be physically located at a number of places in the harness, but it always located between the same two components. Start at the red, plus, battery post and follow the battery cable to the starter solenoid. On the same top post of the solenoid where the battery is hooked there is another smaller red wire. Follow this small red wire and it will lead you directly to the fuse.
Yes, I have checked and replaced the 20 amp fuse. Relist, answer came too late. Relist, answer came too late.
Did you still want help? I see you relisted that the answer came too late, but my response was 3 minutes and 46 seconds after you posted. Would you prefer to work with a different expert? If so, I'll opt out so the question is open again. Please let me know. Do you have a voltmeter or test light to do some troubleshooting?
I do have a voltmeter. I bought a battery from Cub Cadet. It came dry. I added water and charged on my battery charger. Under charge it reads 13 volts. After trying to start it goes to about 8 volts. I try to start the mower with the battery charger on and still nothing.
Bad drop concerns me. You shouldn't see more than a 2 volts drop. What does the battery read without the charger hooked up? A fully charged battery is about 12.6 volts and by the time it gets to 12.1, it's about 50% depleted. Have you tried jumping it with a vehicle battery, vehicle not running? Also, have you tried using a jumper cable directly to the B+ terminal on the starter from a known good battery, such as a vehicle? The black jumper cable hooked from the battery to tractor frame ground, and the red touching the starter terminal directly to see if it cranks. It will spark a bit, but this would test the function of the starter and remove everything else, so we start isolating the problem.
I have not tried that. I did try to jump the starter. But this is what I did. I clipped a jumper wire from the hot lead of the solenoid to the starter hot lead. Needless to say, that did not crank the starter.
Try direct from the battery, please. Also, we can do a test on the solenoid, assuming everything else is good. At the base of the solenoid there are a set of small terminals with, usually white and black wires or orange, attached. If you take a jumper wire and go from the top terminal of the solenoid that the positive battery cable is hooked to, not the one to the starter, and touch it down to the terminal where the white or orange wire is connected, making sure the terminal with the black wire remains properly grounded, does the engine crank normally?
I'm going to conduct these two tests right now. It will take me 10 to 15 minutes.
Sure thing. I'll be standing by.
I tested the battery voltage 12.6. I have it on a trickle charge. I took a jumper cable from the battery side terminal on the solenoid, which has 12 volts at that connection on the solenoid, to the small terminals on the bottom of the noid. No crank. I took a test light and clipped one end to the points of battery and the hot lead on the starter. Nothing.
If you jump across the top terminals of the solenoid with a screwdriver, do you get anything? I'm wanting to see if the starter turns with voltage. At this point I'm leaning to a bad solenoid, but the voltage drop you mentioned earlier bothers me. Do you get voltage at the small terminal at the base of the solenoid you jumper to if you try starting it normally with the key switch?
The solenoid is new. I will check for voltage at the small terminal while trying to start normally with the key switch. I will try to power up the starter. I will do this now. I have voltage at the small terminal on solenoid when using the key switch. I am not sure if I'm powering up the starter right.
Thank you.
I have voltage at the small terminal on solenoid when using the key switch. I am not sure if I'm powering up the starter right.
The solenoid is basically just a magnetic switch that closes the top contacts when the small terminal is energized so that current flows across the top two large wires from the battery to the starter. I don't see the results of jumping across the two top terminals with a screwdriver. Did you get a chance to do that? This will let current flow directly from the battery to the starter, so it checks the battery, large cables, and starter all at once so we know if there's a problem there or if it's in the low voltage safety part of the circuit.
I just went out to the tractor and used a screwdriver to jump the terminals on the solenoid. Nothing, no spark, no bumping of starter. Is that possible?
There's a few things that can cause this. 1. Battery is bad. 2. One of the two cables connected to the solenoid are bad. Do you see any signs of corrosion that would be interfering with current flow? 3. The starter is bad. 4. The ground cable is bad or has lost contact. I would start with inspecting all three of the cables, the two red connected to the solenoid and the black wire running from the battery to the frame. I would inspect the black one very carefully from your last description to make sure you haven't simply lost connectivity there.
I went out to the tractor and inspected the cables. They look good. The ground is sound, but the connection had grass and debris around the bolt head. Then I tried to jump the solenoid with the screwdriver. It sparked up and sent power to the starter. I did this again, and while jumping the solenoid the battery charger maxed out. If that means anything, I do not think the starter cranked the engine. It did make a humming noise.
I would not suggest having the charger hooked up while testing, just as a precaution to prevent any damage to the charger. A vehicle battery is a safer choice if possible, depending on location. Does the engine turn by hand if you try turning the crankshaft from underneath using the pulley above the electric clutch? Do you see anything that may be binding the engine?
Rick, I moved the crankshaft by hand earlier today. There was some resistance but did move freely.
Since the engine is moving freely and the starter is not turning, let's make sure whether that starter is doing its job. Can you take a pair of automotive jumper cables and connect the black clamp to the frame of the tractor, the other end red and black clamps to the vehicle battery as normal, and then touch the red clamp to the bolt on the starter where the battery cable is connected? That will remove everything from the equation other than the starter itself.
I am almost done for this evening. I will test the starter tomorrow the way you describe. The starter should turn the engine if it is good, and if it doesn't, I take it that the starter is bad. If the starter does turn, then I am wondering about this battery. It came dry and I thought for a moment that it had no cranking amps. I will tomorrow clean up the ground cable connection to the frame. I want to pay you, so if the starter fails the test, replace it. If the starter is good, I am looking at bad connections on the cables. If the starter is good, does one of the safety devices holding it out? I hope I tested a small terminal test of the solenoid. If you could just recap. You have been very helpful to me.
Since you were getting voltage at the small terminal at the base of the solenoid when the key switch is operated, the deck is disengaged, the brake is on, and the seat is occupied or held down, tells us the low current circuit is working fine and voltage is flowing through the fuse, key switch, and safety switches. If you are getting voltage at that terminal, you must be doing it correctly. You would not read voltage there otherwise. Ground is necessary for everything to work, or there's no return path to complete the circuit, so be sure to check the black battery cable carefully. The starter does require a good deal of current, so if the battery is not putting out sufficient voltage, or if the cables have extra resistance due to rust, corrosion, dirt, bad connection, etc., that will not let the battery get what it needs. The battery should be about 12.6 volts when fully charged and sitting at rest. A good battery should drop no more than 2 volts when you engage the starter. This is a good poor man's load tester that is pretty reliable. If you jump the starter directly to the B+ terminal where the battery cable running from the solenoid is hooked with a known good battery using a pair or auto jumper cables hook like we discussed, that will tell you is the start is good or bad. Unless there is a parasitic load on the engine such as a bound belt, or an engine that is seizing due to lack of lubrication, overheating, etc. But since you are able to turn the engine by hand, I think we can rule all that out and just conclude that if the starter doesn't crank when the jumper cables are hooked up, the starter is bad.
If you have a home improvement or appliance question and want to chat with an expert now, visit JustAnswer.com/YTHI.